All right, man, peace. So, brothers, I caught this nice little segment here featuring Mr. Scottie Pippen, who we all know is one of the great two-way players of all time, arguably the greatest defensive small forward of all time, not even taking into account the 20 points per game and the great transition offense that he normally would display on a game-by-game basis all throughout the late 80s into the 90s. He happened to be on the panel here when the host asked him a question about hand checking and the impact that it has had on the NBA. So let's pay very close attention to what Scottie says, because one thing that I'll give Scottie great credit for is that he understands the importance of keeping things in their proper perspective. He had his era and his time. This era is different. He's good with that. And that's a part of maturation. When we look through the annals of time, especially modern history in this society that we live in, many times the sports world is a reflection of the society going on around it. And the top sports stars are very indicative of what's going on in society at that time. When you think Muhammad Ali, Bill Russell, you think the 1960s and many of the events that were transpiring with the civil rights. When you think about people like Jack Dempsey, you think about the Roaring Twenties. Also Babe Ruth, of course, where there was great excess during that time period. When you think about Joe Louis, you think about the Great Depression and also World War II. And this time period today in the 2010s, we're accustomed to things becoming easier. Right now we have cyberspace, we have smartphones, things of that nature. And the sports world is reflective of that. And the NFL, they no longer want the defensive backs to be able to put their hands on the receivers. In baseball, they want more home runs. In the NBA, no hand checking, and that's been the case officially for the last 20 years. Those of us who watched basketball in the 1990s know that you did not have to be a great offensive team to possibly even win a championship. And that fact existed well into the early 2000s. You could be an average, fair to middling offensive team and still win a championship if you played non-parole defense. And those Chicago Bulls teams, what made them so great is that normally they finished anywhere from number 1 to number 5 in offense over the course of their dynasty, and defensively they were normally either 1, 2, or 3. When you have those two essential metrics going together in tandem like that, it's almost a guarantee that at the very worst you're going to make the conference finals. But just to get back to the point, they're going to ask Scottie Pippen about hand checking and who he believes probably would not have been as successful as a player had they played in his era as they are today. I'm already on record as stating that in my view, James Harden, if he played in the 1990s, he'd be a great sixth man. He'd be great scoring off the bench. He would not be anywhere near the player back in the 1990s that he is today. He'd be like a Dale Ellis or somebody like that, who on certain teams he might start, on other teams he'd come off the bench, and he'd be a dude that every once in a while would erupt for 40 points off the bench. But he would never be trusted to start because he plays no defense and he has no post-up game. And back in that era, the referees did not give you all the breaks that they give him today. So anyway, they're going to talk about it. I'm going to chime in.
Welcome back to The Jump. I'm George Sedano in for Rachel Nichols. That's Nick and that's Scottie. And on this date in 1999, the NBA Board of Governors approved several rules changes for the 1999-2000 season. One of those rules forever changed the game of basketball. And that rule was this, the hand-checking rule. A defender may not make contact with his hands and or forearms on an offensive player except below the free throw line extended.
The reason why the NBA passed this rule is because after the 98-99 season, the ratings have plummeted so much. Keep in mind, that was the year after Jordan retired. The ratings had gone down so much, and the NBA Finals, which featured the San Antonio Spurs versus the New York Knicks, was the lowest rated finals in like 20 years. So David Stern realized that he had to do something fast.
This would go on to be referred to as the end of hand checking in the NBA. So Scottie, how did banning hand...
Let me also say this. They love to show these highlights of excellent level defense being played back in the 1980s and 90s, like every team played this type of defense. That is not the case. That's number one. Number two, most of these highlights are either from the Eastern or Western Conference Finals or the NBA Finals. By the time you get to those rounds in the playoffs, everyone's intensity is on a 10. I've said this before because it's the truth. The 1980s was not a great era for defense. I don't care what anyone says. That was a very offensive era, and the defense did not start to creep in until the late 1980s.
Changed the way you played defense.
Took me out the game. it changed tremendously because, I was in...
Once again, brothers, pay very close attention to these highlights. Look at the players that they're featuring. Scottie Pippen, Michael Jordan, Joe Dumars. These are players who made all defensive teams. John Stockton, the all-time leader in steals. They're trying to make it like every team played this level of defense back in the 1980s. That is not the case. Now in the 90s, the pace started to slow down, and you also had many teams that had the enforcer power forward. The Antonio Davises, the Dale Davises, the Charles Oakleys, so on and so forth. You don't have that today as well. That's another reason why the game has sped back up.
Latter part of my career, and players were getting faster, so it was a difficult change for me to be able to make that adjustment, because now I'm defending players that are younger and faster, so wasn't able to keep up, and it really changed how the game is today. And that's why we see that there's a lot more scoring, a lot more freedom, movement out on the basketball court, and it's made the game more exciting because fans want to see guys score the basketball.
How do you think players today would fare if these rules were still allowed?
I think some would do well and some would probably struggle. But you know, it was, to me, it was great for.
They should have pressed Scottie and asked him, which players do you think would struggle back in the 1990s? That's the question that they should have asked him as a supplementary question. In my view, once again, and most people will say, oh, Stephen Curry. Stephen Curry would definitely struggle. I think that Stephen Curry would adapt far better than James Harden would.
It allowed players to be great on both ends of the court.
Right.
Kyrie Irving would probably struggle a bit more back in the 1990s as well, because he would not get as many shot opportunities. He'd be forced to be a more conventional point guard, as opposed to what in his mind he seems to think of himself as a 6'2" Kobe Bryant. They would not tolerate that back then.
It seems more of an offensive-driven game. Even you look at the All-Star game, it's really about players that can score the basketball and not about the best players in the game. And I think some players, and I'm going back to Patrick Beverley again, guys like that, they kind of get looked over, and that's his mark in today's game as a defender. And he's not going to be a guy that's going to go out and score the basketball. That's not what he is his DNA. He's about defending and stopping people and frustrating them.
The good thing about Pat Beverley, though, is that he can score.
To some degree, that's been taken away from the game, the defensive end, and players have lost that edge that they felt that they had.
Scottie is somebody who grew up watching those great Bulls teams. And
when you watch Curry try to play defense, he puts forth all the effort, but he trips over his own feet because his balance is so bad. His hips are always misaligned, and he's never deep in a crouch. He's never deep in his stance. He's standing up way too tall.
You and MJ put up. If you took the hand check out in your era, do you get upset because your numbers would be that much greater?
No, I would not get upset about it. Myself and Michael, we were two players that we enjoyed playing both sides of the basketball.
And back during that time period, they called players like Michael Jordan and Joe Dumars and Scottie Pippen complete players. They didn't call them two-way players like they do today. I have no idea where this nonsensical title of a two-way player came from. But back during that era, you had to play both sides, both offense and defense, to be considered a complete player. Magic Johnson played better defense than most of these point guards do today, and he was considered a liability on defense. Larry Bird, many people might not understand this because he's considered to be a big, slow white guy. He was on more than one all-defensive team. Of course, he was not a first-team all-defense. I believe he made a couple of second-team all-defenses or maybe a third-team all-defense. But early on in his career, in the early 80s, he was someone who put forth a lot of effort on defense, especially guarding other great small forwards like Dr. J and Bernard King and Alex English and Dominique. Of course, they're going to get their points because they're great offensive players. But my point being, those guys back then, they knew that they had to put up an effort on both sides of the basketball floor or the coach was going to pull them from the game.
You know, Michael, again, was the greatest scorer to ever play in the game. So he always competed and challenged players on the other side as to shoot the ball or things of that nature. And then, you know, he would do things to frustrate them, knowing that on the other end, he had the upper hand as an offensive player. But I think in today's game, if they played the way we played in the 80s and 90s, it would tremendously help the game because we would see players that can show greatness on the other end of the basketball court. And I think that's something that we've lost for the last 10, 15 years.
I would say this, though. If you and Michael and Barkley and all these guys played in this era with no hand checking, your numbers would be ridiculous. Nick is right about that. They would be out.
That's true, but Barkley never played any defense anyway.
No doubt.
Yeah.
I mean, but it's hard to win.
Yeah.
Anybody can win on those nights because you're going to have some bad shooting nights.
Yes.
But if you can defend,
Sure,
and be able to give those hand checks, you can make up for that.
Yeah.
But in today's game, if you have a bad shooting night,
Yeah.
you're probably going to lose. You know, it's
No doubt about it.
hard to defend a team unless they're just having a bad shooting night.
Right, for sure. Now let's take a look at this graphic that we have here, where this is the scoring leaders pre-hand checking rule in the 98-99 season. So look at the numbers there: Iverson, Shaq, Malone.
Let me say this, though. Once again, that season was a nadir for the NBA in the modern era. The 1998-99 season was an extreme low point in the modern history of the NBA. That's why they had to change the overall paradigm of the league. And David Stern understood that he had to keep tinkering, because even after he quote-unquote took away hand checking, the league was still extremely defensive all the way until about 2004. That's when they started to climb out of it a little bit. But during this time period, this is right after Michael Jordan left. So all the players in the league were trying to play in his style, meaning I'm going to be the superstar, surround me with 4 other guys, I'm going to play hero ball down the stretch of these games. That's really what hurt the league at that time. And I also remember very vividly during that season, Allen Iverson saying that he wanted to win the NBA scoring title that year. So you already know, if he averaged a little bit under 27 points per game, that also was probably his shooting percentage. He probably shot about 27% from the field.
And Keith Van Horn. And now let's take a look at the leading scorers now.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a big difference. It's good.
Right, but you know what? I guarantee you, if you go back to the 1986-87 season or the 87-88 season, the scoring leaders looked a lot like this. Let's not act like this is an explosion in scoring by individual players that we've never seen before. Because once again, back in the 1980s, dudes was putting up buckets back then.
I think the league will get to a point with the way scoring has exploded in the last 5-10 years where they say, you know what, maybe we need to go back to the old days a little bit and put it back in.
I don't think they can put it back in. I think that players have found a way to master the game.
I think they could put it back in if the fans start to get bored with the repetitive video game style that we see today of everybody just jacking up 3-point shots.
And I give a lot of credit to James Harden and Kevin Durant, Steph. Those guys have found a way to master how to score the basketball. It's hard to take that away from them now.
The only thing that scares me, though, guys, is when you go watch high school games, college games, all anybody wants to do now is shoot.
Right.
Like, nobody wants to defend, which is what makes guys like Patrick Beverley and P.J. Tucker stand out even more in this era. But has the game lost a defensive identity at all in the lower levels because of what Steph and Harden and KD have done?
Once again, what we're seeing not only in the NBA but in all sports, where the people who are managing the entertainment product known as Major League Baseball, the National Basketball Association, the National Football League, they seem to have their finger on the pulse of Western society. That being that most people today do not like to face opposition. They want to be able to say and do whatever they want without people telling that they're wrong. That has a trickle-down effect over into these sports leagues, where they understand that people just want to see offense, offense, offense. Nobody wants to see stops anymore. Who knows? It might come back into vogue, but I think that the only way it's going to come back into vogue is if there's a reemergence for the appreciation of the quote-unquote masculine principle.
I think it has lost a little bit of defense on the perimeter area, if that's what you're calling. The lower area, which I would consider a big, they haven't really lost that. You know, big guys have always been protecting the lane, protecting the rim, helping whoever gets beat. That's what they're back there for, is to defend and deflect shots. But I think out on the perimeter, It's the way the game is now is more exciting.
Yeah.
They would never go back to allowing players to check guys and stuff like that.
Scottie, do you really mean that, brother? Or are you just saying that on television so that you don't come off like a hater? Stop it.
You look at Steph. Steph shoots that ball from half court because he got freedom.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Well, he also shoots it from half court because they know, when I say they, I'm talking about the coaching staff knows that he's proficient at taking that shot. It wasn't like Steve Kerr told him, Steph, go out there and pull up from 40. Steph decided to do it multiple times, and for the most part, he makes that shot. So Steve Kerr had to fall back.
Yeah, and he knows that. But the only way you're going to guard a guy like Steph, especially if he's handling the ball, is how I guarded Magic. You got to get up and make him work from 94 feet. And when he get in the half-court situation, that hopefully he's working against being exhausted as well as working against the clock.
I see what you did there, Scottie. You're trying to perpetuate that narrative that you're the one who shut down Magic Johnson in the 1991 finals. Once again, this notion, this false narrative that gets put forth out there by a lot of quote-unquote Jordan haters that Magic Johnson lit up Michael Jordan in Game 1 of the 1991 finals, and after that, Phil Jackson put Scottie Pippen on Magic and shut him down, is complete balderdash. Magic Johnson was dominant for the entire finals. Why is that? Because he's Magic Johnson. Beyond that, Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen defended Magic Johnson about 50-50 for the remainder of that series. As a matter of fact, Jordan guarded him a little bit more than Scottie Pippen did, and Jordan's defensive metrics on Magic Johnson were higher and better than Scottie Pippen's was. At the end of the day, you're never going to shut down a Magic Johnson. He's going to average 18, 12, and 9 in just about any series that he plays in because he was that complete a basketball player. But once again, I see what Scottie's trying to do here.
He's going to have a moment, but hopefully some of those things work in your favor as a defender.
I found a way to fix the All-Star game as we go through this
Oh, boy. Let's see.
hand checking in the All-Star game.
Oh, yes. I like that.
Now,
Well, yeah, because the All-Star game is ridiculous.
The All-Star game is done.
It's a layup line. If you hand check in the All-Star game, how much different does that make everything become?
Yeah, I don't know if they'll let the guys handshake at the All-Star game. Guys don't even barely want to play in the All-Star game or make any effort in the All-Star.
Yeah, they're making too much money now. Too much guaranteed money. All-Star game is done. There was a time period back when I was a kid where the All-Star game, they played that as hard as a playoff game in the second half.
All right, since we're...
But anyway, that's basically it on that. Peace.